In the time period of the fleet and before, the 1715 and before that, 90% of Europe's economy was based on the gold and silver from the Spanish New World. Every year or so, there would be two fleets meet in Havana, one from Veracruz and one from Cartagena. They would join up, create one large fleet, and then take the Gulf Stream up along our coast, and they were kind of slingshot over to Europe. The ships themselves were, in effect, purpose-built. They were made to carry heavy cargoes, because gold and silver are heavy metals, and they were made to be heavily armed. The bad part was they were very slow. So they could fight their way out of a lot of things, but they couldn't run away from a lot of things. When I'm speaking here at the museum to people of a certain age, I point out it's a lot like the B-17 during World War II. It was heavily armed, carried a respectable bomb load, but it didn't go that fast. When the war started, fighter planes could still outrun it, so that they have to be well protected. So that's what happened here. In 1704, the War of Spanish Succession breaks out in Europe. For 10 years, there are no fleets. And you can imagine fighting a war for 10 years with no income coming in. It's over in 1714. The first fleet of sail is 1715. It's probably, and I believe wholeheartedly, that's probably the most valuable fleet in today's money that ever sailed. To give you an idea, in the book Golden Galleons, they picked up, in what's now Frederick Douglass Park area, they picked up two and a half tons of gold they salvaged in 1972. And that's when it was going for $40 an ounce. And as I understand now, it's going for $1,800 an ounce. So you can see 10 years of accumulated gold and silver, plus the people who couldn't make it back themselves, they had their own fortunes that they brought along. And much of it was in jewelry and in chains, because if they put it all in ingots, the Crown would take a percentage, a shipping fee. They put an important person in charge who, as we know, important people don't necessarily know what they're talking about, but we do know that they exist. And he was ignoring all the warnings that a hurricane was coming. Everybody from the common barefoot sailor climbing the mast to the captains who were under him were saying, we have a storm coming. He was under the impression, as I understood from the book, that he can outrun it because they had sails and wind pushes you fast. 48 hours later, the entire fleet is sunk along our coast, the Treasure Coast, and 1,500 people are dead. And when Europe finds out, they start to go into depression because all this money they've been waiting for is not coming. One of the first things that they did, of course, the survivors, was to start salvaging. And that's where they turned to the A's Indians, because at that time many sailors couldn't swim because it was God's will. If you were to die, you were to die. And they all knew they were sinners because they had a really good life. On the other hand, if you're out in the middle of the ocean, how good do you have to be a swimmer? So there's a practical side to all of this. So they hired the A's Indians who could swim and dive, and they were bringing up the treasure. And the treasure's still being washed up and picked up by people, because we really don't have a good idea of how much treasure was on the fleet. Now, the Treasure Coast was a term that was put together in the early 70s because they were pulling treasure off our coast, and it was one of those things that the newspapers come up with. We were actually part of the Gold Coast. But there came a time period when there was a lot of chaos in the south part of the state that we didn't want to be associated with. And so they decided Treasure Coast was a pretty good name.
If you like this kind of content, please subscribe, like, and share.